Rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. MashaAllah, man, it's good to meet you. I don't think, wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. I don't think I've had the pleasure of meeting you in person.
We have not met in person. In fact, there are many people I've not met in person in the wake of COVID, but alhamdulillah, I get to know them very well, and I look forward to doing that with you, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah, I look forward to it as well. First off, I want to apologize for this very poor lighting. I think I have the camera light, and that's it, because my children, normally I record in the basement of my home, but my children are down there. I don't know what they're doing down there, but I figured it would be safer for me to record in the office. So I retreated to my office, but I don't have the lighting that I normally have, and I hope that isn't a distraction. First off, I want to ask you, with the election about 2 weeks away, you know, we're coming down the stretch run. Things are tense in many quarters of our community, seeming as though you are at the tip of the spear when it comes to Americans and civic mindedness, civic engagement. American Muslims, how are you managing? How are you processing the events of the day?
So, Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulullah. First, thank you for the invitation to join you. Alhamdulillah, I appreciate it and look forward to a good conversation, inshallah. So, to answer your question, I'll just say, putting aside CAIR and all the work that on a personal level, you know, I think I've been heartened by the fact that so many American Muslims, no matter what side of the debate they're on about who to vote for, are planning to vote, are planning to make their voice heard, recognize the importance of being engaged civically and turning out to vote. You know, especially given all we've seen over the past year. I mean, it can be very easy to become jaded and disillusioned and just walk away from the political process after watching our government fund a genocide. So the fact that people are still fighting, even after a year of failing to achieve what we wanted, which is stopping the genocide, I think that's a good thing. I do feel somewhat disappointed and disturbed by some of the harsh language I've seen used by Muslims against other Muslims when they disagree about how to handle 2024. I think some of that has been just unnecessary and not helpful. And so that's been troubling a bit. But those are just kind of my personal reflections. As an organizational leader, you know, main focus is getting people to turn out to vote, no matter who they're going to vote for, and also trying to pressure all of our candidates to get as close to where we want them to be as possible so that whoever wins, you know, we have a fighting chance, inshallah.
No, inshallah, I think that's a good comprehensive answer. I've also shared some of those sentiments about just the ill will that I've seen being expressed by certain very vocal political advocates, you know, in our community. However, I think some of that is to be attributed to just the emotional charge of the moment. I mean, we are witnessing a veritable genocide. And even though I think everyone should vote their conscience, Muslims are grappling with, how do I use my vote strategically to, you know, express, you know, my values. And, you know, it isn't reasonable, I think, that we would expect our community to turn out as a monolith, right? People have different investments, people have different locations, and their vote would probably reflect those. But on an issue as singular as Gaza, right? This appears to be, I can't find one dissenting opinion anywhere. I think it just heightens the emotional charge, because it's almost as if we know the mission is clear. What should the mandate be? And I think that's where most people find themselves. How is CAIR managing in this moment?
Yeah, so no, I think you're completely right. That look, we've all, you know, for the past year, many of us get up in the morning, and after we do our dhikr, the first thing we do is check Al Jazeera and see what happened overnight, right? What did the Israelis do in Gaza, in the West Bank? And every morning without fail, we wake up and see, you know, kids being killed, women being killed, hospitals being, and it's been a year of seeing that. So people are rightfully furious, angry, and that desire to do something is going to come out sometimes in emotional ways, sometimes in ways it wouldn't normally come out. And when you see people doing things that you think is fundamentally misaligned with the goal of ending the genocide, of course, you're going to get upset with them. So I understand why people are getting emotional. But at the same time, we also have to keep our bearings about us and not cross the line when we are expressing, disagreeing with each other. So, Hamza, I think most people are doing a very good job of that. It's just, WhatsApp, social media, it can bring out the worst in people. Now, in terms of CAIR, so I have two roles. So one, I'm the deputy director of CAIR National. That is the civil rights organization that everyone is hopefully familiar with, inshallah. And so we focus on defending the rights of Muslims from discrimination, explaining Islam to our neighbors, advocating on Capitol Hill, etc. So that is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So that means that as a nonprofit civil rights group, CAIR does not endorse candidates. It does not oppose candidates. It just stays out of partisan politics. It can lobby, it can educate voters, it can meet with elected officials, but it can't tell people who to vote for. Separately, I have a role as a board member with CAIR Action. That is a 501c4 political organization that can endorse candidates, that can engage in politics. So I'm going to answer your question in two parts. So from CAIR, the C3 nonprofit side, our main focus is educating voters about where all the candidates stand, whether it's Trump, Harris, Stein, or West. We just released our 2024 presidential voter guide. And then we're trying to focus on assessing where the community stands. We conducted a poll about a month ago of the community to figure out how they were planning to vote. And it was very fascinating. Showed 29% for Jill Stein, 29% for Kamala Harris, 11% for Trump, and then a lot of undecided, some people not voting. And it showed Gaza was the top issue, but that people just disagreed about the best way to address the issue of Gaza. So from that CAIR C3 perspective, those are the main focuses. And the last thing I would say is turning people out to vote, making sure the community does not get disillusioned and stay on the sidelines, because we're all paying taxes. We're all part of the game. You might as well get off the sidelines and influence how the game is being played. Now, separately, on the C4 side, the political side of things, I'll put that hat on. So, our main focus is to work in coordination with the American Muslim 2024 Election Task Force. That's a coalition of Muslim political groups that got together early this year and said, we're going to make a joint recommendation to the community about how to vote in 2024. We want to do this together, present a united front. And so we spent months analyzing the options, trying to decide what was best to do. When Biden dropped out, we had to start over. And I'll talk about our conclusion if you want to, but bottom line, our focus there. Yeah, okay. So our conclusion that we reached, and we put out our statement it's a little over a month ago. I think we announced our position. Our position is that the C4, I'm only speaking for CAIR Action, the C4, our recommendation to the community was, number one, turn out to vote, no matter who you're voting for. Number two, we encourage you at the presidential level, vote for any candidate you want, as long as that candidate supports a ceasefire in Gaza and suspending the transfer of American weapons to the Israeli government. Those are our two baseline, bare minimum demands that we have of any candidate in order to get our support. And that's what we recommended to the community. Now, obviously, the only candidates who have taken both of those positions right now are Jill Stein, Cornel West, and some of the other, Chase Oliver, some of the other third-party candidates. Vice President Harris supports a ceasefire, but she has said she does not support an arms embargo on the Israeli government, even though it's required by the law. And Donald Trump has said that he wants Israel to finish the job and do it quickly. So we didn't endorse any candidate. We just said to the community, pick who you want as long as they have adopted those two positions. So our main focus right now is educating the community about that recommendation, encouraging people to take that route, but also encouraging people to disagree respectfully. If they decide to do something else, that's okay. There are legit arguments to vote for Vice President Harris. There are legit arguments to vote for other third party or other candidates. So we respect that. So our main focus is getting the community engaged and activated and ready to vote.
Okay, so you guys were talking in the context under the auspices of the C4.
Yes.
You did not identify a particular candidate to endorse.
Correct. Absolutely. We did not endorse a particular candidate. We said, pick whoever you want. The American, pick whoever you want, as long as they've adopted those two positions. So, meaning, for example, if tomorrow Kamala Harris, has a revelation and says, you know what, I support, suspending weapons to the Israeli government, well, she'd be eligible for the community support because she now has adopted that position. And if tomorrow Jill Stein said, hey, I don't support that anymore, I want to give all the weapons to Israel, well, she would no longer be eligible. So from our perspective, it was a a way to avoid getting wedded to any one candidate and everything they believe in.
Mhm.
Right, because every candidate that's running has flaws, deep flaws. Jill Stein, Cornel West, Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, to varying degrees, there's something you can find with all of them that would be a potential problem. But
Sure.
our perspective was you endorse the position that you want the candidate to take and let community figure it out from there. And we trust the community to do the smart thing, inshallah.
So one of the debates that I've heard, broached in community often is the virtue of voting for a third party candidate versus voting for one of the two mainstream political party candidates.
Yeah.
Maybe as a person, dealing with this issue in a full frontal way, maybe you can help us to kind of talk through some of the pros and cons of each approach.
Inshallah, Bismillah. So let me start with the argument to vote for Vice President Harris, even though it's not the position we took because she hasn't adopted the arms embargo. I think it's a reasonable position to take, even if we may disagree with it. So the argument that I've mainly heard goes like this, that Vice President Harris has expressed far more sympathy for the Palestinian people than President Biden ever did. That Vice President Harris has called for a ceasefire very early on, that she has gone, said after she became the nominee that she's not going to be silent about Palestinian suffering. She chose a vice presidential nominee who was not openly hostile to Palestinians when there was an option on the table who she could have chosen who was hostile to Palestinians. She didn't preside over Netanyahu's speech to Congress. And when she met with him afterwards, she gave him kind of the cold shoulder, didn't take any a smiling photo with him, delivered remarks by herself afterwards. And initially, she was avoiding saying whether or not she supported an arms embargo. Initially, when she was asked the question, she would dodge, which was actually a good sign because the easiest thing to do would just say, no, I don't. But initially, she was dodging it and not saying yes or no. So that was actually a good sign. And so the argument that people make is that, look, she has shown some positive inclination to do the right thing. She is currently Biden's vice president, so she can't go all the way and say what we want her to say. And if she were to say what we want her to say, she would be attacked by the pro-Israel lobby. She might lose key votes in certain states, and so she's not willing to take that risk. So we should take what we can get from her, especially because Donald Trump is surrounded by people who are anti-Palestinian racists, who say Israel needs to annex the West Bank, finish the job in Gaza, bomb Iran. And so the argument is Donald Trump would almost certainly be worse on the issue of Palestine. And therefore, we should just, hold our nose, vote for Vice President Harris so we have a chance to try to get the agenda. That's the argument that is made. Again, it's not an unreasonable argument, right? The counter to that argument, I think the problem is, number one, Vice President Harris was taking some initial positive steps that were promising, but things really went bad in August, starting at the DNC convention. A few things happened. One, there was an Israeli family that spoke, and they spoke very powerfully about their relative who's being held captive in Gaza. They actually, acknowledged Palestinians. They got a warm reception. So the Muslim Palestinian community said, well, look, can we have a Palestinian speaker come and do the same thing? Talk about what people are experiencing in Gaza, call for a ceasefire, and this Palestinian speaker would have endorsed Vice President Harris. The campaign refused to allow any Palestinian at all to speak at the DNC. And that was incredibly disturbing because the question raised was this: if the Muslim and Arab, etc. community could not convince the Harris campaign to allow a Palestinian to speak for 3 measly minutes, even though that person would have endorsed Harris, how can we expect that in the White House we'll be able to convince her to completely change U.S. policy towards Palestinians, right? If we couldn't get that very simple thing done, what is that? How does that bode for the actual policy, right? And around the same time, her national security advisor came out and said explicitly she does not support an arms embargo on the Israeli government. And then she, over and over again started saying, my commitment to Israel's security is ironclad. We'll have everything they need to defend themselves. It said the same thing over and over again. In fact, if you ever listen to Vice President Harris, if she's asked about Palestine, she literally gives the same answer every time with very little variation. She starts by saying, this all started because of October 7th, and October 7th was horrible. And she notes with great specificity claims about that day, not only the mass murder of people, she mentions brutal rapes. She goes on about October 7th. Then she says Israel had the right to defend itself. We as Americans would defend ourselves if that happened. Then she says how Israel defends itself matters. And then she says too many Palestinians have been killed. And she talks about Palestinian deaths in the passive voice, as if they were victims of a natural disaster, right? When it's Israelis, she talks about rape, being murdered by Hamas.
Very perceptive.
It's passive voice, right? And then at the end, she says, and I support a ceasefire. But what she never does is say how she will achieve a ceasefire. She never says what she's willing to do to make Benjamin Netanyahu accept the ceasefire deal that he keeps sabotaging. From our perspective, an arms embargo is the way to stop him. But she is taking that off the table and won't lay out what she's going to do to get a ceasefire. So that's the con argument that, look, if we vote for her, we're basically sending the message that you can commit a genocide and you will still get the Muslim community's support. So there's literally nothing you can do to disrespect the community, and we will still stick with you. And that would set a precedent that we really don't matter. You can do whatever you want to us, and we're still going to come home because we're afraid of the other side. So that's the pro argument. That's the con argument. I'm sure I'm missing some things, but that's for the Vice President Harris thing. Now I could do Trump and Stein and others if you want, but that's
please indulge us, man. For me, someone that, of course, I've been following. I think everyone has been following, but I've been listening to some arguments in these quarters, some arguments in these quarters, some arguments in these quarters. But I think seeing each of these views compared side by side and dissected, extensively, I think this would benefit our viewership tremendously. So, okay, we're looking at Harris. Let's look at Jill Stein. We're going to look at Trump last. Let's look at Jill Stein, because Jill Stein has enjoyed, I'm in Chicago, I'm in Illinois, pretty strong, and this is one of the largest Palestinian enclaves in the country, right here in the southwest Chicago suburbs. Jill Stein has enjoyed impressive support here, impressive support in other places I've traveled to during election season. Her running mate is a personal friend of mine, a person that I know to be a person of great integrity, great character, very thorough. So I'm personally, invested in the success of the Stein-Ware, campaign. But what do you see as pros there? What do you see as cons there?
Yeah. So I'll explain all, and I'll explain what people who support them and oppose them say. So I'm not expressing just, here's what I understand the pros and cons. So for Jill Stein, so what the argument that is made for people who say, look, we need to endorse her specifically, not just endorse a principle, but get out and vote for her in particular. So the argument is that, number one, the community is a large segment of the community is just not going to vote for Kamala Harris unless she changes her position, right? And we need them to vote. We want them to show up and vote. You have to give them something to do. They need to make their voice heard and make sure our votes are showing up somewhere to show that we have power, we can impact elections, we can tip the races in various swing states. So the argument is, look, Jill Stein clearly and unequivocally supports a ceasefire. Jill Stein has for years, not just recently, but for years, been speaking up for Palestinian human rights and been critical of the Israeli government. Jill Stein literally put her body on the line. There's video of her in Atlanta at Emory University, where I am, getting beaten up by the cops right alongside college kids on campus. So the argument is, look, Jill Stein has taken the right position, physically put her body on the line to support that position, and has actively reached out to the Muslim community and even picked a Muslim as her vice president. So the argument is, look, she has earned the community's support, number one. Number two, she is on the ballot almost in the entire country. And therefore, she's really the only option for your vote to show up somewhere if you don't want to vote for one of the major parties. Cornel West is not showing up on many of the ballots, neither are the other third-party candidates, except for the Libertarian guy. And so if you want to vote for someone who supports an arms embargo and a ceasefire, if you want the vote to show up somewhere, then the best person to vote for is Jill Stein. And if you do that, this is the argument, that if you do that, then the Democratic Party and others will see, whoa, look at all these votes for Jill Stein in these swing states like Michigan and elsewhere. The Muslim community wasn't joking. They put their foot down and said, look, come what may, we are not going to accept genocide. That's our red line. And so if you want to win our support back in 2026 and 2028, you've got to change policy. Otherwise, we're going to keep doing this, keep voting for a third party and let the Democratic Party sink or swim on its own. So that's kind of the pro argument that I hear, is that she's taken the right position. She's the only third-party option who has that wide support. And this is a way to show the community's distaste with the two parties and make sure that our votes show up somewhere.
Right.
There are arguments. Those are the ones I hear most often. The counter argument to that, the counter argument is, number one, the obvious one, that if you don't vote for Kamala Harris and you vote for a third party, you are increasing the risk that Donald Trump will win. And Mr. Trump has indicated that he would allow Netanyahu to do even more than what Biden has allowed, with little pressure, potentially annex the West Bank, potentially bomb Iran, which they're planning to do anyway right now, by the way, among other things. In addition to that, there's a risk that Donald Trump would be surrounded by anti-Muslim bigots who would want to weaponize the Justice Department in America to try to shut down organizations that advocate for Palestinian human rights, whether it's American Muslims for Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, other groups that have been already targeted by Republicans in Congress, but they can't do anything because they don't have the presidency. So if Trump was in office and had control of the IRS or the Justice Department, then he could try to silence advocates for Palestinian human rights. So the argument goes, look, you may not like Kamala Harris, but if you vote for Jill Stein, you are increasing the risk that the genocide will continue and that Trump will be able to crack down on Palestinians and Muslims and others here at home. And that's a risk we can't afford to take. The other counter argument is that, Jill Stein and the Green Party have not done enough to build out a strong infrastructure, that they just show up during presidential years and then disappear, and that they're not consistently trying to build up a credible third party challenge. And that essentially after this election happens, they're not going to get close to 5% because the polls show they're only at 1%. And so they don't have a path to become a credible, formidable party. And so it's better that we build within the Democratic Party rather than throw our votes away in a third party. This is the argument that the anti-Stein people make. And the last thing I hear is that, there is some people are upset that some Jill Stein supporters can be somewhat harsh on social media, can be very harsh is the word, with people who decide not to support her. And even with Professor Butch Ware, who has made history as Muslim vice president, has said some stuff about Harris that, rub people the wrong way, people in quote mark and implying they were going to hell, that kind of stuff is not something that, I think a lot of us think is appropriate. And I would say that from my perspective as well. So those are some of the counter arguments that I hear regarding the Jill Stein. So those are some of the pros, some of the cons. There's more on both sides, of course, but those are the most common arguments I hear for and against her candidacy.
And I'm gonna test the extent of your impartiality here.
Yes.
Pro and con arguments for Trump.
Yes. Woo. Okay. So the danger of this is people can clip this out of context and hit that I'm not. This is not my opinion. Let me say again. None of this is my opinion. I'm giving you, as a good lawyer, I'm giving the arguments that others make for both sides. A good lawyer could argue that OJ did it and OJ didn't do it just as easily on both sides. So that's all I'm doing. I give you the pros and the cons. Okay. So with that caveat, not my opinion, I'm just telling you what the argument is. So there is a minority of Muslims in America who do plan to vote for President Trump. Back in 2020, the CAIR poll showed, I think 70% voted for him, 17% voted for Trump. The poll that we did in August, showed 11% planning to vote for him. Now, what are the arguments for this that I hear people making? So one argument is that Donald Trump has an anti-war streak. That back when he ran in 2016, he condemned the Iraq War, said it was a horrible decision. He criticized Republicans for getting America embroiled in Middle Eastern wars. He said America first means we should worry about stuff at home. He was very critical of the George Bush administration and neoconservatives. So the argument is he has an anti-war streak that might lead him to actually be more resistant to the Gaza war continuing than we might think. Number two argument is that he has made an effort to reach out to the Muslim community. He's gotten endorsements from some Yemeni Americans who he's met with directly. The father-in-law of his of his daughter is an Arab American Lebanese billionaire who's been going around trying to get him connected with the Arab community. And Trump has been meeting with Arab Americans and Muslims without preconditions, without saying in advance, you got to endorse me. He's just meeting with them, hearing them out. And then some of these people are endorsing him because of that direct engagement, because of whatever he is that he's saying behind the scenes. So there's a feeling that he's making an effort and that we'll be able to deal with him if he is elected. And then the other argument that I hear sometimes is that, its social issues, right? That many Muslims are concerned about the rights of parents and children in school systems,
Sure, sure.
about the morality of public society, about respect for religious freedom. And there's a fear that the Democratic Party is hostile to religious freedom, hostile to the rights of parents and kids in schools, and that Muslims have more in common with Republicans on those issues. And therefore, despite what's happening overseas, the argument they make is that we should vote on those social moral issues for Republicans. Those are the most common arguments I hear for Donald Trump. I haven't really heard anyone make the argument that we should vote for him to make Kamala Harris lose. I haven't really heard anyone making that argument. Most people that I hear who don't want to vote for Kamala Harris don't say we want to make her lose. So I haven't really heard that argument for the most part, but you might have a few people who say that I'm voting for him because I really want to make sure she loses. But I really haven't heard people make that argument.
Do you think that there's an inherent danger in being single issue voters?
So every community has a red line, not just Muslims. Like every group of voters has some sort of red line, something beyond which they are not going to vote for a candidate. So I'll give you an example. For many voters, it's Social Security and Medicare, right? If tomorrow Vice President Harris came out and said, you know what, I support raising the retirement age to 70 and I support cutting Social Security benefits by 5%, right? Let's say she announced that. And let's say Donald Trump said, well, you know what, I support raising the retirement age to 75 and I want to cut benefits by 15%. Even though Donald Trump was promising a worse position on Social Security and Medicare than Harris would be proposing, a large number of Harris voters still would not support her as a matter of principle. They would just say, look, Social Security and Medicare are my red line. Anyone who wants to cut Social Security, I'm not voting for them, period. Even if the other guy wants to do something worse, it's a matter of principle for me. I'm not voting for anyone who wants to cut these programs, right? Or abortion, right? A lot of people that's a big issue for them, right? So if Vice President Harris tomorrow said, you know what, change my mind. I don't want to sign a law that enshrines Roe v. Wade into law, right? And so for those who don't know, Roe v. Wade, that court ruling essentially said that states must allow doctors to abort the unborn for any reason whatsoever, at least up to viability, which is around 6 months, according to most doctors. So the plan that she has adopted is I'm going to pass a law saying that. Now, if she came out tomorrow and said, you know what, I changed my mind, you know, my position now is we should only require states to allow abortion up until, let's say, 12 weeks, right? She decided to shorten the time. So you're only going to be able to get an abortion for unconditional reasons up to 12 weeks. If she announced that position, right, she would lose a huge number of supporters among Democrats, among some women voters, even if Donald Trump came out and said, you know what, I'm doing 20 weeks. Even if he said he had a harsher position, she would still lose voters because that is their red line, right? Abortion is their red line. So for the Muslim community, for many of us, it just so happens that genocide of Muslims is, or anyone for that matter, I should say, that genocide period is a red line, right? That we can compromise on social issues, we can compromise on even the Muslim ban, but the one thing we can't compromise on is a genocide. That is where we draw the line, is 100,000 or more people being killed with American taxpayer dollars. So is there a danger to being a single issue voter? Yeah, there is, because you could end up losing on that issue and then a bunch of other issues that are important to you because you weren't willing to play the game and compromise and be quote unquote reasonable. So there is a risk to being a single issue voter. Just like, you know, people who might vote in those scenarios I gave you about abortion, Social Security, they might end up with a retirement age of 75 because Trump gets in, or they might end up with a 20-week abortion limit or whatever. You know, so there's a risk that people would still take because their principles just matter more than the risk to themselves, right? It's just a principle thing. It's their red line. Every voter has it. Every voter has it. It's just ours is genocide.
You know, because the reason I ask is because, you know, I heard this one perspective, and this came out of, I think, an impressive kind of politically pragmatist approach. They said, I don't think, this person said, either candidate is willing to take the approach you mentioned with regard to Israel, arms embargo, ceasefire. I don't see either major party candidate taking those lines. However, with regard to Sudan, right, America could certainly intervene and stop the carnage, stop the bloodshed in Sudan, right? And if we broaden our scope, right, to include Sudan in our, you know, political concerns for the candidates, we wouldn't feel as though we gave the vote away, We wouldn't feel as though, one candidate said that he wanted to intensify hostilities toward Muslims, and another said the security of Israel is sacrosanct. I'm unwilling to sign off on an arms embargo. Okay, let's look at Sudan, and let's maybe focus our attention there. Then we would be able to engage the electoral process with some integrity, even if we didn't get what we wanted vis-a-vis Gaza and Palestine.
Yeah.
So that's why I was asking, being just a single issue, voting block, are we perhaps missing something in that regard?
That's not an unreasonable position to take, is that, look, if we think both major parties are bad on this issue, let's move to the next thing that's really important and try to get someone to move on that issue and then vote on that issue. That's an argument. Now, I think the counter to that is that what's so unique about Gaza is that it's not only a genocide, but it's a genocide that the United States is directly funding, right? That our tax dollars are funding. Sudan, the United States is very close to a certain Middle Eastern Muslim country that is very supportive of one of the sides in the Sudanese civil war. I won't mention which, because I don't want to end up on a travel ban if I have to travel to the Middle East. But so those in the know what I'm talking about. And so our government does have some potential influence there, but neither candidate has really even talked about that issue. And neither candidate seems interested in getting involved in it because, sadly, to be frank, racism runs deep. Black people getting killed ranks even lower in the totem pole than Palestinians being killed. And that's the sad reality of the world we live in. So I think that from my perspective, I think we can argue for all at the same time. We can argue for a better U.S. policy towards the Sudanese civil war. At the same time, they were arguing for a better policy on Gaza. But at the end of the day, if you do have to put your foot down about something, I think people would argue that, look, our government is directly funding what's happening in Gaza and Palestine. And therefore, we have a special moral obligation that we don't necessarily have to all the other, like the Uyghur genocide, right? China is conducting a genocide of Uyghurs as well. And we speak out against that very forcefully. But at the same time, our government's not funding it, right? So maybe it's not number one on the list of things that we can do anything about. So that's the argument. But again, there are so many reasonable arguments about how to handle the election. That's why I think it's so important that we don't just dismiss or condemn each other because we reach a different conclusion, right? There are reasonable explanations for why you'd vote in different ways and pursue different strategies.
One argument that I heard that for me was really compelling was that if we voted for a third party candidate, we could, and we did it en masse, we could, open the political process somewhat, maybe for 2028 or 2032, try to get the Green Party, for instance, to 5%, so that political discourse in America is enriched. Because, this perspective offers that just finding ourselves in between this one and this one should in and of itself be frustrating. And that maybe the strategy is thinking about 2028, thinking about 2032, and how can we vote in a way that enriches our options, that gives us, more options, even if that vote negatively impacts, the situation in Gaza in the immediate, because that negative impact might only be incrementally worse than, from candidate to candidate.
Yeah. No, and I've heard that argument as well. Like, I think if it were true that Muslims voting in mass for Jill Stein, along with others, could get her to 5%, that would unlock a certain amount of federal funding for the Green Party in future elections that would allow them to play more of a role in elections and potentially, push the Democratic Party to be more receptive to voters who they normally would ignore, because they'd be worried, oh no, those voters really might be reachable now by a more empowered Green Party. So that is an argument. If you look at the polls, it seems incredibly unlikely that the Green Party will get close to 5% of the vote. Jill Stein did very well back in 2016 in terms of the raw vote count, but still was only 1% of the total vote. And that was when you had two very unpopular candidates running, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. I think the Green Party, for them to have really had a shot at getting close to 5%, I think two things would have had to have happened differently. One is I think Joe Biden would have had to stay in the race. him dropping out and Kamala Harris replacing him really did allow her to consolidate much of the Democratic base, including young voters, women, and others who may not have been willing to vote for Joe Biden. And number two, Cornel West would have had to have stuck with the Green Party. Cornel West initially ran to be the Green Party nominee. And for some reason, he decided not to pursue that further, and he went independent. What that did was it put him in a situation where he's running as independent. He does not have the infrastructure that the Green Party has on his own. So he's had to build this from the ground up, and he's not on the ballot in many states. He just he's not going to get there, right? If he had been the Green Party nominee, what you would have had is someone who, as an African-American academic, civil rights advocate hero, he could have pulled a significant number of the Black community's votes, because he would have been on ballots across the country, in addition to the Muslim community's votes, and doesn't have the baggage that Jill Stein has. Like, Jill Stein has issues about Bashar al-Assad in Syria, Vladimir Putin, and other things that are just kind of odd that still kind of hang around her neck, even though she's tried to address those issues. Cornel West, I think, really could have had a real impact on this election if he had stuck with the Green Party. I don't know why he didn't. But that's not how it played out. So I don't think they're going to get 5%, but it's an argument. And I think people who support are going to try to do it, but that's not what the polls are looking like. The last thing I would say, Sheikh, is that the two-party system in America is so entrenched. So entrenched. The only way I think you could realistically truly break the two-party hold is if a popular figure who is a Democrat or Republican broke with one of the parties and founded a new party and was able to take a significant number of people with him. So let's say, for example, Donald Trump had broken away from the Republicans and founded a new party, right? That could have posed a real threat to the two-party system because of his name recognition, his popularity among certain Americans. That could have posed a real threat. And actually, I will give you, ironically, an example of this. And so it'll be a funny example given what's going on. Israel. So the two dominant parties in Israel for decades were the Likud party, which is the right-wing, openly racist, party, and the Labor Party, which is also horrible in many ways, but, was a little friendlier to the concept of peace and Palestinian statehood and blah, blah, blah. So these are the two dominant parties. Ariel Sharon, who was a war criminal extraordinaire, became the leader of the Likud party, and he decided to pull Israelis' settlements out of Gaza because he concluded that eventually Palestinians would start demanding a vote once they realized they were never going to get a state. And he wanted to separate Israelis completely from Palestinian, quote unquote, land as he viewed it, so that could never happen. So he wouldn't have a South African situation. His plan was, let's pull our settlements out, put up a wall, get them away from us, and then they'll never be able to demand a vote. Now, the Likud party threw a fit when he did that because they wanted to gradually eat up and gobble up Gaza. So they tried to stage a revolt. What he did is he broke away and he founded a new party called the Kadima Party in Israel. And that party went on to win elections because he had his name recognition, his popularity, and he was able to break that hold of those two dominant parties. So I think in America, that's the only way it could realistically happen is if you had some prominent politician who'd already gone up through the ranks of the Democrats or the Republicans breaking away and creating a new party. Aside from that, I don't see a realistic way to break the two-party hold.
No, I think you're right about that. I mean, even when we're talking about breaking the two-party hold, it would have to happen at more levels than just the presidential level, right? When people talk about breaking the two-party hold, they mean in the presidential election, but you still have, a number of elected officials that will be either Democrat or Republican.
Right.
Maybe, as we we have maybe 15, 20 minutes before we kind of open the floor. And I also want to open the discussion a little bit. Just thinking about why civic mindedness is important for our community. I'm going to look, I had you in the CAIR, one CAIR camp. I'm going to bring you back to neutrality, bring you back to another CAIR camp. Thinking about civic mindedness, in our community. In the past, some people have scoffed at, involvement with American politics, electoral politics, policy reform. Why do you think this is a foolhardy approach to being a community that is situated here and now?
So, that is an argument to make, and you can understand why people would become cynical after everything they've seen. And how, again, entrenched the two parties are, it can look impossible to change. And so I can understand why people would feel that way. But here's the thing about being Muslims in America is that we have, I would argue, and some would argue, a unique opportunity to influence our government's policies that Muslims around the world do not have, depending on where they are, right? If you live in certain Muslim countries, you can't criticize what your government does. You're going to go to jail, right? You can't vote in free elections, right? You don't have the option to change anything. So how can you be blamed for not changing things, right? You can't protest, you can't freely vote, you can't criticize. So you just kind of have to make dua, and that's it. In America, though, we do have the legal right to protest, to vote. And this government really can impact people and does impact people around the world in good and bad ways. So we have this unique opportunity to change things through our vote, through our advocacy. So don't we have an obligation to try to do so? Since we all pay taxes, we all fund what the government's doing if we're working, right? We're already part of it. We're part of the system. So don't we have an obligation to at least try to change the way our money's being spent? To influence how this game is being played. And if we sit on the sidelines of politics, does that really excuse us for our moral responsibility for what politicians are doing with our money, right? Because we're still paying the taxes, right? We're not going to jail, saying we're not going to pay tax. We're not leaving the country and renouncing our citizenship. We're staying right here, paying the taxes. So don't we have that opportunity and obligation to responsibility to do something about it? That's the argument that I would make. And again, that doesn't mean everyone has to be an activist, right? Not everyone is going to be protesting. Not everyone's going to be donating. But that bare minimum thing, I think, is voting, right? And I think that's a bare minimum thing. And then beyond that, donating to organizations engaging in activism, right? Or making dua for them, or giving a kind word, or sharing their work, or literally even social media, right? Sharing stuff on social media really does matter. If it did not matter, you would not see anti-Palestinian groups obsessively trying to get Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and blah, blah, blah to censor advocacy for Palestine. They're trying to censor it because they know it matters. So even that little thing of speaking on social media counts. May Allah accept it from people who are sharing the videos and sharing commentary. And again, that is something you can't freely do in many countries, right? If you in certain Muslim countries, criticize your government's silence or lack of action for Palestinians, you're going to the dungeon, right? And so, again, we have this unique opportunity. So there's an argument that we have the responsibility to do something with it.
I've also heard it said that we shouldn't, equate civic mindedness with electoral politics, that they aren't exactly the same thing. And that even if someone decides, it's not a decision that I agree with, but if someone decides to be critically disengaged vis-a-vis electoral politics, the responsibility of being concerned about what takes place in one's environment, in one's community, is still a religious responsibility. I remember once being with a friend of mine in an apartment complex that he owns, and he mentioned to me that they do voter registration drives, in that complex. And I don't know if I scoffed at it or I did something that was indicative of a dismissiveness. And he said something to me that I don't think I will ever forget. He said, there are people that have vested interest in preserving the status quo, and the fact that you are dismissive, they appreciate that. This is not something that troubles them at all. In fact, this is something that ingratiates them. And I thought to myself, wow, that this is true. This holier than thou kind of, politics, too dirty. It entails too much compromise. I just can't, no, I don't think that this is a tenable position for, a Muslim that wants to live his or her values. However, even if one decides that I'm not voting for anyone in this election, civic mindedness is still, a core aspect of our religious identities, in my estimation.
Absolutely. And one thing I'll add is that in addition to the fact that our opponents would love us just to disengage and walk away completely and not try to change things, is that as dark as things seem right now, one of the great things about America, as critical as people can be about our government, is this country's ability to change.
Of course, correct.
So if imagine if you're sitting in the 1950s, and you're plotting the bus boycotts and the lunch table sit-ins and all that, how futile might that have looked, right? How difficult could it have been to imagine that you were going to succeed? If you jump to 1968, you passed the Civil Rights Act, you've done all this, but things still haven't really changed significantly. And then Dr. King gets killed, Bobby Kennedy gets killed. I mean, how dark was that moment? Could you really even imagine that jumping ahead, 10 years, 20 years, Black people would be leading in every aspect of our country, sports and entertainment and politics, a Black president, at some point? I mean, it would be very difficult to imagine, yet it happened. Even the fight against apartheid in South Africa, right? Mm-hmm. For the longest time, Nelson Mandela was dismissed as a terrorist. Our government refused to stop its relationship with the South African government. Pro-Israel groups like the Anti-Defamation League were defending the South African government and attacking Americans who criticized South Africa, much like they were attacking Americans who criticize Israel today. So it's like, and no one could have really imagined, is this really, or is South Africa going to be free? And yet it was. And last example I'll give you is the Soviet Union. No country over the past 100 years has really been more, not only hostile to Muslims, but successfully hostile to Muslims, meaning the Soviet Union literally wiped out Islam among generations of people in Eastern Europe, right? They would not allow freedom of religion in the countries they controlled. Mm-hmm. And so you would have thought, wow, Islam is done in those Soviet states. The Soviet Union's been around for 1,000 years. How could the Soviet Union, this nuclear armed country, ever lose its grip? They didn't even last 100 years, right? Mm-hmm. The Qadr of Allah, they collapsed. Those countries went free, and now Islam is returning in those countries where it was wiped out. And it's still, faces oppression. It's still a struggle, but it's coming back, alhamdulillah. People have held on to their faith, and it's coming back. So as difficult as this moment may seem, think about the Soviet Union, think about South African apartheid, think about the civil rights movement. Unexpected things can happen, and activism can change things for the better, inshallah. It's Qadr of Allah. We just have to make the effort.
Yeah, no. The arc of justice is, the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice, right. Like you said. And I think that, for us, it reinforces this, religious principle that, if you were planting a tree and it were announced that that Judgment Day was tomorrow, the Prophet ﷺ said, continue planting the tree. In other words, don't think about the pragmatic kind of impacts. Don't think about whether or not this will really have an impact. Just do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Advocate for the right things because they are the right things. Leave the results to Allah. Yeah. Right? Leave the results to Allah, but commit yourself to a life of principle and act according to those principles. And don't worry about anything else. I think this is something we have to emphasize in this moment. Although I will say, and again, I don't want to end up on any travel ban either. I think that the reputation of the state of Israel has certainly taken a blow, and I see that internationally, especially among younger people. And I think that in the next 10, 15 years, I don't think that the reception that the state of Israel receives globally is going to be the same as the reception that it has received in the past. I think that there will be lasting impacts, lasting consequences, lasting ramifications to this latest genocidal campaign in Israel. I see that.
Yeah, the Israeli government is incredibly self-destructive, meaning that they pursue short-term victories at their long-term expense. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu has been, to be frank, the biggest gift to the cause of Palestine.
Absolutely.
I mean, he is the one who, because of his hostility to President Obama and the Iran nuclear deal, turned Israel into much more of a partisan issue in America, as he's so unpopular among Democrats. He's the one who has, explicitly admitted that the Israeli government does not want a two-state solution. And by pursuing this genocide, he has really raised awareness about the plight of the Palestinian people among a new generation. Right? You have American college kids going to jail, giving up their careers to speak up for Palestinian human rights. And even in the Arab world, I think a generation of young Arab people grew up and they didn't see what happened in the Nakba themselves. They didn't see what happened in the 60s and 70s themselves. They didn't even see what happened in early 2000s themselves. And so I think some rulers in the Arab world thought, okay, we can just mollify our people with giving them entertainment, let them have some fun, don't worry about what's happening. But they use social media. They can see this genocide. And so I think you have a generation of Arab Muslims who are now fully engaged in this issue in a way that they may not have been a year ago. And so I think it makes it much more difficult for Arab leaders that wanted to just toss this issue aside and worry about, economic growth to do that, because their people are re-engaged on this issue. So yeah, I think ironically, the Israeli government in the long term has done incredible damage to itself, even if they emerge, with these short-term victories in their mind, because they are killing people, they're not being stopped. But in the long term, the damage they've suffered in terms of their reputation, their relationships, their legal standing, that's long-term damage. And sometimes it's sadly, when you think of the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan, sometimes corrupt governments make a fatal mistake that is their undoing. They think they're winning. Like the Soviets controlled Afghanistan for 10 years. They're running the show, but they didn't realize that ultimately was going to be play a big role in their oppression coming to an end. So the Israeli government, I think, should listen to those Jewish human rights activists and Israeli Americans who oppose the genocide and are trying to convince them, hey, this is not going to end well for you. You think it's going to end bad for the Palestinians. It's not going to end well for you either. You've got to stop this. Give the Palestinians a state, give them freedom, because this does not have a good ending. I don't think they realize that. I think they're incredibly self-destructive.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, it's the worst kind of hubris. It's the worst kind of hubris. It's the worst kind of hubris. But I wanted to ask, a question. I have some thoughts about this too, but I want to hear what you have to say first. Someone said, how should immigrant Muslims reconcile with Black Muslim leaders who have endorsed Kamala Harris?
Yeah, that's a good question. So number one, I think, and I've said this, and actually, putting my political hat back on, when the American Muslim Election Task Force issued our statement, our position statement, one of the things that we said in that statement was people should disagree respectfully, that there will be disagreement about this election, and that we should not turn disagreement about 2024 into a racial or religious conflict. And we said that because we could already see some people trying to make the argument that Black Muslims supporting Kamala Harris. It's the immigrants who oppose her, and there's a divide, and the immigrants care too much about foreign issues. Like, that is the subtle argument that I heard some Black Muslim supporters of Kamala Harris trying to make. And I just completely rejected that. I think that opinions about 2024 cross racial lines. Yes, there are Black Muslims who support Kamala Harris and feel that we should do that. There are immigrant Muslims who oppose her, but there are also Black Muslims who are planning to vote for Jill Stein or Cornel West, who have a real issue with Kamala Harris over Gaza. And there are Arab American and other immigrant Muslims, quote unquote, who are planning to vote for Kamala Harris. So there's not this monolithic position where it's Black community here, immigrant community here. That is not the reality of where we stand. And I think it's very cynical for, if you want to vote for Vice President Harris, just do that and make the argument for why you should vote for her. Don't say, well, I'm Black and she's Black and the Black community, knows this country. And so we feel like that's what the Black community has to do. And don't make the counter argument that immigrants only care about, Palestine because they're from over there. And that's why it's important to them. They need to focus more on. I just think that's such a dangerous argument. And I've heard it a little too much. And so I don't think that immigrant Muslims and Black Muslims need to reconcile over disagreement. I think that, again, it crosses racial lines. And I think if there are any quote unquote immigrant Muslims who are upset that Black Muslims signed a pro-Harris statement, they shouldn't be, right? If you want to get upset at someone, just get upset at anyone who supported that position, not just the Black community. It shouldn't be singling them out. And on the flip side, the Black community who supports Kamala Harris should not be getting upset at immigrant Muslims who vote a different way, because it's not just them, right? It's not just immigrants who are voting a different way. So I just think we all have to give each other some grace and some space and not turn this into a religious or a racial conflict. It doesn't have to be that. It doesn't need to be that. That's the last thing we need is that sort of division in the community.
No, I mean, I think for the most part, I agree with that. I think that some people feel as though, how can I say this delicately? I want to make sure that I say this well. I think some people are, they feel as though there's no equity. They feel as though there have been many, elections. Forget elections. There have been many social issues that demanded the support of the entire Muslim community. But these were issues that mostly impacted Black Americans, right? These were issues that mostly impacted people that were working class or people living in inner cities. And Muslims maybe showed some indifference to those issues, or at the very least, were not as politically astute as the Black American Muslim might have hoped for. But now that there's an issue that, yes, it is affecting all of us as Muslims, right? It's almost like my brother's house is on fire. This is not the time to talk about, to settle any past wars or rivalries. I just want to see the fire extinguished. And I think all of us feel that way as Muslims. I think some people are raising this as a topic of discussion because the idea that you would be upset or angry with me for voting my self-interest, when in the past you've always voted your self-interest, right? It's a position that some Black American Muslims probably regard as audacious, to say the least. But I'm with you. I think we have to give each other space.
Yeah.
I think we have to give each other grace. I think that succumbing to attempts to make this something racial, something religious, I think all of those must be categorically rejected. This isn't, as you mentioned, the statistics clearly show that you have people from every ethnic background in the Muslim community voting for every candidate.
Yeah.
Right. So, we can't reduce this to this, these, racial or ethnic blocks. Yeah. But for someone to say that I have no legitimacy religiously, or I have no legitimacy personally, just to vote my conscience.
Yeah.
When they have in the past always voted their conscience, right. Even if that vote ran contrary to something that would have explicitly served me and my interests, I think that is a little forward.
And if anyone is make that argument, I think that is a problem, right? I think, again, if any Black leader concludes that, look, for the Black community in America, which has all sorts of challenges that we face, most important thing is vote for candidate X. And I understand that candidate X might be harmful in Gaza, but I still think that candidate X is going to give us a shot on Gaza, and it's going to definitely help on the local Black issues. That's an argument, right? That's an argument. No one should poo-poo that argument, so to speak. But on the flip side, though, I think, again, just the Black community is not monolithic in that view, right? And so that's the one thing, is that we have to make sure that those who decide to make that argument should know that they're not speaking for all Black Americans, right? And saying they've reached that conclusion. And also on the flip side, I would say that, there is truth to the fact that Black Americans, because of our long history in this country, do have a certain, not have a unique understanding of the country that others do have as well. But I'll give an example, like George Bush and Al Gore in 2000, okay? Mm-hmm. So I was a kid back then, right? But I've heard all the stories and the arguments that happened, right? And so a large chunk of Muslims voted for George W. Bush, who had reached out to the Muslim community, supported religious freedom, said, I don't want to get involved in wars in the Middle East. And his father had been somewhat critical of the Israeli government. Meanwhile, you had Al Gore, who wouldn't meet with the Muslim community, who chose a running mate who was incredibly hostile to Palestinians. Mm-hmm. And the Clinton administration, under that government, had used the DOJ to target Muslims in a really unfair way to some extent. So that is why many Muslims, especially of an immigrant background, voted for George W. Bush. Now, many Black Americans did not do that. I'd say the overwhelming said, nope, not going to do it, because they knew, I would say, what the Republican Party was capable of, and about the fact that there was an element of racism that still existed in the Republican Party, and that could come out. And that's what happened, right? Bush gets elected, and 9/11 happens, and all of a sudden, tables are turned. You have war across the Middle East. You have the worst traits that existed in that political party came to the fore, and eventually in the form of Donald Trump. So Black Americans might look back and say, hey, we told you, we warned you, what could have happened, right? You didn't listen to us, and so look what happened. So that's an argument that can be made. And so I do think that, just like, with you have the Ansar, you have there is some truth to that, we should listen to each other and learn from each other, but also respect the differences and not just demand that everyone adhere to one monolithic view.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. Sabir, I saw that we had some questions from the audience. This is a very relevant, very germane discussion, and I want to give people an opportunity to participate, inshallah. So do we have questions for Brother Edward? Someone said, can you read the question? I'll read it aloud. I'd love to hear your perspectives on how Muslims should navigate the balance between morality and pragmatism if our options can be viewed as evil, lesser evil, and morally good, but nearly impossible. So between those three categories, something that is evil, lesser of two evils, and morally good, but nearly impossible. How do we navigate that space?
Sheikh, I think that's a question for you. That's a question, morality, and maybe you should tackle that one.
No, I mean, I think that part of this is going to be a very expedient way of dodging the question. I think that part of being a Muslim is embracing indeterminacy on a number. I was with one of my teachers, and he said that the Prophet, peace be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, would pray this prayer that many of us are familiar with, called Salat al-Istikhara, this prayer of decision making. And he said, what does that imply? What does that entail? And me thinking just about the Prophet being, a very devoted, worshiper of God, said, well, it entails him being completely reliant upon Allah. He said, yes, but it also means that there is no level of religious guidance that will obviate the need of appealing directly to God because you don't know what to do. That even the Prophet, peace be upon him, the messenger of God, who was being directly communicated with by God via revelation, still came to impasses that he just said, I don't know which way I should take. I'm going to put my hands up to God, exhaust all of my resources, make the best decision I can, and hope for the best. If this was the messenger of God, why would we expect to have cut and dried responses to all of these questions? Maybe, and this, like I said, might seem like an expedient way of getting out of the question, maybe our faith is increased because we are wading into uncharted territory and just saying, I exhausted all of the resources that I have, and this is the decision that I have come to. I pray that God puts good into it, and that is a faith-affirming exercise. And it's also, to Brother Edward's former point, it's also a chauvinism suppressing exercise. If I know that I've come to my conclusion vis-a-vis means that are not definite, vis-a-vis means that are not foolproof, then I'm less chauvinistic about my views. I mean, I was weighing my views. One of my teachers would always tell me, when you're arguing someone's position, never treat their position as though it has no merit to buttress your own argument. That's not necessary. Rather, try to see the merits in all positions and then still make a decision. فَإِذَا عَزَمْتَ فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ. After you've made a decision, the Quran says, then rely upon God. But sometimes there are competing points of view that all have merit, that all should be considered. But I put my weight down here, and I hope for the best. And I think with a lot of those questions, that's probably the best we can do. Another thing that I would say is each one of these issues must be resolved on a case-by-case basis. I find that one of the changes in our, I think, information in our kind of I would say the way that we think about data is that everybody wants a technical approach that is applied 100% of the time, right? This is I think a symptom of the modern age where everything is for dummies, everything is, everything is for dummies. Everything is exactly, it's almost like just give me a technical criterion that I can apply in every case, and this matter will be solved.
Yeah.
Well, for lots of things, there are no technical criteria that I can give you to apply in every case, and the situation will be resolved. Each situation must be resolved on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes it might be better to choose the lesser of two evils. Sometimes it might be better to choose something that is nearly impossible, but states a moral principle very strongly. Like, I'm principled about this, whether this can ever actually affect the outcome of a given situation. This is where I'm putting my foot down. Sometimes that's a better approach. Sometimes, sometimes you might have to, like, as in the case of like the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, you may have to accept terms that were explicitly wrong for a greater good. I mean, all of this is within the realm of possibility and the purview of consideration. So I guess that's my way of saying, I don't know.
I felt you should have taken that one. Alhamdulillah, that was good. Like, you've answered it thoroughly, mashallah.
Do you think the Democratic Party changes its dynamics on Palestine if they are out of power? Does a more fraught American society post-election help or harm the Palestinian issue long term?
That's a really good question, because
This is the argument made. He's good. He asked some good questions.
And I think it's a reasonable argument that imagine if everything that happened over the past year in terms of U.S. support for the genocide in Gaza had happened, but instead of Joe Biden being president, it was Donald Trump. And Donald Trump had done everything that Joe Biden had done. I think there is a fair argument that the Democratic Party would have been strongly and much more vocally opposed to the extent to which Netanyahu has waged this war with U.S. support. I think there would have been calls for a ceasefire much earlier on. And I think the fact that it was a Democratic president in office supporting this led to a rally around the leader effect, where sadly political parties are not moral entities, right? They are ultimately about getting people elected to advance certain causes. And so because it was Biden, the party battened down the hatches and just stood and defended it, even though he was doing something they would have completely opposed if it was Trump doing it. And so I say that to say that if Trump is back and the genocide continues, some people argue that it will actually be easier to organize more people against the genocide, because now people on the political left won't feel like they have to defend Joe Biden anymore. He'll be gone. Right now, they can just oppose Trump and oppose the genocide that he's supporting, and that it might be easier to do that. So that's an argument. It's an interesting argument. Maybe it's true. Could be true. The flip side, though, is that if the Democrats lose this election and they blame Muslims and Palestinians for it, they may not actually learn the lesson. They may actually become very upset and just say, you know what, you're on your own. Forget you all. Forget Palestinians. I think there's an argument that could happen as well. And I think we have to be indifferent to that possibility, because we're not begging for anyone's support or solidarity, right? You want to do the right thing, we're happy to welcome you to do the right thing. You want to, go and do something else, fine. So I don't think that we should make decisions based on how we think the Democratic Party might react or not react. But I think it is a distinct possibility that for some people who are not standing in solidarity with us right now, they would if Trump was the one doing all this stuff, as opposed to a Democrat. I think that's possible.
Yeah, very good answer. Very good answer. No, very good answer. I think we may need to wrap up after this. I always offer the guests the closing thought, last thoughts, anything you'd like to share.
Alhamdulillah, if I said anything good, alhamdulillah, may Allah accept. Anything bad, may Allah forgive. I will repeat my legal disclaimer that anything I said here that was political or partisan was on behalf of CAIR Action, our political group. Anything else, either myself personally or on behalf of our civil rights group. And I would just say, alhamdulillah, I mean, I would say that, things like the Gaza genocide, crises like the Gaza genocide should really drive us all before we're voting and protesting to get closer to Allah. I think if you took the time to protest, but you didn't take the time to say your 5 daily prayers, you got it backwards. I think the greatest threat to Muslims in this country is not that we're going to get locked up in concentration camps or deported. I think the greatest threat to us is that what happened to other religious groups will happen to us, meaning that people grow up in this country, they gradually become secularized, they gradually give up parts of their faith to become accepted and popular. And one day they look up and the next generation is nominally that religion, right? They are proud to say, yes, I'm proud to be X or Y or Z, but they don't really believe in the Holy Book anymore. They don't attend religious services. Their politics make no sense in terms of their religious beliefs. And so my great fear for Muslims in America is that could happen to us. They'll wake up one day and we'll have a generation of Muslims who are nominally Muslim, incredibly secularized, liberal in ways that just contradict Islam. And we've achieved success financially. Like we're in entertainment, media, sports, political leaders, a Muslim president, but no one is actually faithfully, for the most part, Muslim anymore, right? We've achieved material success, but lost, the spiritual goal that we had. And so inshallah, I don't think that'll happen. I think actually the Gaza genocide is reminding people of that we are dependent on Allah and that we have to get our stuff in order. But again, I think that's still out there, that uber liberalization of our community, that secularization of our community. So I do think we have to be mindful of that and make sure that does not happen to our next generation. And so yeah, that's the one parting thought I would leave is that I think that was a much bigger concern before the genocide happened. We don't talk about it as much, but it's still there. And I think we can't forget about that is, from my perspective, number one thing that Muslims in America have to worry about is holding on to our faith for future generations, inshallah.
MashaAllah. Man, this was a wonderful conversation. I'm gonna get your number from Sabria. I'll shoot you a text message so we can stay in touch. I really enjoyed this. I learned a lot. I personally loved the objective kind of assessment of the pros and cons of, voting Democrat or voting Republican or voting Green Party. I think we need more of that kind of dispassionate, expository informing of our community around politics and voting, because everything now, sometimes it seems it's so politically charged and it's so partisan that, which naturally leads to a lot of polemic. Everything is just, very, very polemical. But when you can get someone that's willing to take the time to say, okay, I'm just going to kind of look at this objectively. Now, of course, I'd assume you have your positions, right? You have your positions as. And
by the way, in this whole, you did not hear my actual personal opinion about the election at all. So I've only shared others' opinions.
Only because I thought it would be, a bit, brazen to say, well, just who are you gonna vote for? But if you want to share your personal position,
I don't. Hamza, maybe offline, inshallah. Inshallah.
So next time, inshallah, afterward we'll debrief.
Inshallah.
Assalamu
alaikum. Thank you all. Assalamu alaikum.
Inshallah. MashaAllah.
All right, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all for joining us tonight. This was a very, very wonderful discussion. Just as a reminder, for those of you who are interested in possibly attending ALIM's flagship summer program, please do check out the interest form is available. We will post that in the comments, inshallah. Also, please do follow CAIR and keep up with their work. Inshallah, we will go ahead and share their work, and please make dua for our guest, Brother Edward, and also Ustadh Ubaydullah. And thank you for joining us. Have a good night. Assalamu alaikum.